Hello, my name is Bob Nielsen. I'm the Extension Corn Specialist here at Purdue University. Today we're going to talk about high yield corn and some of the concepts behind increasing yields in your operation. I want to first start with a look back at some of the historical corn yields in this country. You may not be aware of it, but USDA first began to publish estimates of national corn yields back in 1866. This graph shows the years from 1866 through the mid-1930s in orange. And what's interesting in that nearly 70-year time period is that yield really didn't change much over 70 years. It was fairly static. And then beginning in the mid-30s, around 1937 or so, occurred what I call the first miracle of corn yield improvement. And beginning in the late 30s, yields began to increase at a rate just under 1 bushel per acre every year. Now that's pretty dramatic considering that for the prior 70 years, there was no visible yield increase nationally at all. And then beginning in the mid to late 30s, suddenly we began to see yields increase dramatically. And of course, the major cause of that was the adoption of double-cross hybrids by farmers. We had double-cross hybrids for probably 10 or 20 years leading up to that point, but they simply were not being adopted much. And of course, part of that was the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl years that were certainly not conducive for the adoption of new technologies. But it's pretty dramatic that beginning in the late 30s, yields began to noticeably increase. And that blue line going through those, let me get my laser pointer here, or maybe more importantly, a highlighter. And so this blue line is the trend line that would have continued if that rate of gain continued. And so if we had not made any further increases in corn yield, today we'd be looking at maybe a national yield of somewhere between 80 and 100 bushels per acre. But beginning in the mid-1950s was another change in national corn yield increases on a yearly basis. And the yield increase went from just under 1 bushel per acre every year to almost 2 bushels per acre every year. And that's denoted by the red trend line going through the blue yield data points. And that was think about it. That was a miracle. We doubled the rate of gain from just under 1 bushel to nearly 2 bushels per acre, beginning in the 1950s and continuing for quite some time. Now, in the mid-1990s was the beginning of the adoption of the new biotech traits. And of course, the first one on the market was resistance for European corn borer, followed by resistance to Roundup herbicide, and then followed by resistance to corn rootworm. And that whole process of the adoption of these so-called transgenic corn traits began in the mid-1990s. Now, what's interesting is, to me at least, if you draw the trend line for yield from that point in time where we began to adopt these transgenic corn hybrids, there's really no appreciable change in that rate of gain. And in fact, I would argue that the adoption of biotech hybrids has not resulted in the third miracle of corn yields. They maybe have allowed us to stay on the trend line of about 2 bushels per acre increase every year, but in and of themselves, biotech corn traits have not resulted in a change in that annual rate of yield increase. Well, it makes sense if you think about it, because most of the transgenic traits we have available today are not offensive traits, meaning that they don't literally increase corn yield, but rather they're defensive traits. They either provide easier and sometimes more reliable control of insect pests, or in the case of some of the herbicide-tolerant traits, they allow us more latitude on what herbicides we can use to control weeds. But these are called defensive traits, not offensive traits. And so for that reason, there's really been no increase in that rate of annual gain in this country. And I find that rather interesting. So That's where we've been on a national level. Let's take a look at the folks who set the yield bar, and these are the folks that enter and win the National Corn Yield Contest sponsored by the National Corn Growers Association. So what I'm showing on this graph are the average yields of the top 3 winners in each category and class of the contest since 2007. The red line represents the winners in the irrigated classes, and they represent the average of about 6 to 9 winners every year. The blue line represents the non-irrigated categories, and there are more categories in the irrigated class, and so these averages represent the winners, the top 12 to 18 winners, basically. If you look at that timeline since 2007, the high point occurred around 2015 for the irrigated winners, where the average yield of those winners topped out at 478 bushels per acre. On the non-irrigated class, the best year was about 2017, where the average yield among those 12 to 18 winning entries was 348 bushel. Needless to say, all of these yields are sky high. All of these yields are much higher than most of us achieve in regular life. But it is interesting to look at the timeline. There's been a slow but steady increase in those average winning yields over since 2007. The highest yielding single entry to date was in 2019 by David Hula of Virginia, with a winning entry of 616 bushels per acre. The results of the 2020 contest have not been released as I make this video, so perhaps there will be a new record set in 2020. But David Hula achieved some pretty spectacular yields in 2019 with that 616 bushels per acre. Now that kind of a winning entry is interesting because for years physiologists have told us that the theoretical top-end yield of corn was somewhere around 600 bushels per acre. Well, David Hula showed us indeed it's at least 600 bushel per acre, and in fact that top-end theoretical yield is probably even higher than that. But certainly it shows us where the possibilities are for achieving yield with today's hybrids and today's practices. Now, if I put an Indiana spin on this and look at the winning entries in the National Corn Yield Contest from Indiana versus the statewide average yield published by USDA every year for Indiana, there's quite a difference. And this may be the kind of difference that is more to our interest, because this represents a yield gap between the statewide average yields in Indiana and these winning entries in the National Corn Yield Contest. And this yield gap is somewhere around 120 to 180 bushels per acre. And it's this yield gap that we can look to or maybe aim for to increase yields on our own farm. So let's get back to the National Corn Yield Contest, and what can we learn from these winners? Well, every year the National Corn Growers Association at some point eventually publishes what they call a winner's guide. And in that winner's guide, they tell us what hybrids were used by the winners, what biotech traits were in those hybrids, what seed treatments, if any, were used by the winning entries, what the harvest populations were, what rates of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium fertilizer were used, what insecticides were applied, what herbicides, what fungicides, and what planters and combines were used for the winning entries. So we learn a little bit about some of these agronomic factors that were involved with these winning entries. And so it certainly begs the question that, we are shown some of these things, and the question is, of these factors, do any of them correlate with these winning high yields? Or in other words, can you and I learn anything from what's published in these winner's guides that may give us a hint of how do we go about increasing yields on our own operation? And so you might think that these winners are using aggressively high plant populations. And in fact, we hear the stories about some of these winners that are aiming for final populations of 45,000 and 50,000, or even as high as 55,000 plants per acre. And so you might think that you need these aggressively high populations to achieve record-winning high yields. Well, like many situations, maybe you do and maybe you don't. And if you go and actually look at the historical data, and I keep track of these winner's guides details in Excel spreadsheets. I've been doing this for some time. And so I want to just show you the relationship between the grain yield of these winners in the non-irrigated classes versus the reported harvest population that's in the winner's guides. And so again, I'm showing you grain yield on the y-axis and the reported plant population. And let me just get this playing for you. So maybe, a couple of things to sort of focus on. We're looking at pretty high yields, somewhere between just under 300 to just around or just over 400 bushels per acre. But look at those look at those blue yield points and look at the reported populations. And what you see is that there's essentially no relationship between yield and final population for these non-irrigated contest winners. So in other words, there are folks that are reporting harvest populations of only 30,000 plants per acre, and they're still achieving the high 200s to the mid 300s. And out here at, say, 45,000 or in that neighborhood, there are folks that are also achieving the high 200s up to the mid 300s. All right. Now, again, these are the average yields of the top three winners. It's not the individual winners. It's the averages of these. But again, the bottom line is there's essentially no relationship between yield and population in the non-irrigated classes over a time period dating back to 2007. So apparently aggressively high populations is not the secret. Well, so what else can we look at? Some would argue that you need aggressively high nitrogen rates to achieve these record-winning high yields. And again, we hear the coffee shop stories about these winners that are putting on 400 pounds of nitrogen, 450, 500 pounds of nitrogen. And that leads you to think that maybe you need these aggressively high nitrogen rates. But as with population, you need to look at the actual data and look at the facts. And frankly, sometimes you might need those high rates and maybe you don't. So again, I'm going to show you a similar kind of graph looking at grain yield on the y-axis. And this time we're looking at reported nitrogen rate in terms of pounds per acre, reported nitrogen fertilizer rates. And again, we're looking at the average yields of the top three winners in every non-irrigated class, this time dating back to 2011 because they did not publish the nitrogen numbers before that time. So again, if I play this out for you, looking at yields versus the reported nitrogen rate, boy, that graph looks pretty similar to what we saw in the populations. And again, essentially, there's no relationship between yield and the nitrogen rates that are reported for these non-irrigated winning entries. So again, and this is actually pretty remarkable. If you look at, say, 100 pounds or 150 pounds of nitrogen, and you're still getting yields that are 300 to 400 bushel, okay? So again, this doesn't seem to correlate with high yields. And in fact, there are no correlations with any of the reported agronomic inputs that are shown in the winner's guide for the National Corn Yield Contest. And I find this somewhat remarkable. Well, let me back up. I should be fair and say that there is something that does seem to correlate with high yields, all right? Think about that for a little bit. Of all that list of factors that I said were published in the National Corn Winner's Guides, there are some things that seem to correlate with high yield, and apparently the color of your planter or combine is important. Because in the winning entries over the past 5 or 6 years, 3/4 of the winning entries used green planters, and about 70% of the winning entries used green combines. So clearly, the color of the equipment is important for achieving these high yields. Now, I hope you realize that was tongue-in-cheek, all right? And it sort of reinforces the fact that you can make numbers say anything that you want. Now, the statistics are real, all right? These are the relationships that about 3/4 of the planters were green and 70% of the winning entries used green combines. But we all know that, at least I hope we all agree, that equipment color really has no bearing on yields that you're going to get, and certainly no bearing on achieving these sky-high yields that are reported in the National Corn Growers Contest. So, where does that leave us? What are our options for increasing corn yields based on what we learn or don't learn from the National Corn Growers Contest, and maybe just thinking about high yields in general? Well, I'll share these 3 options with you. First of all, you can follow the tactics that, in my opinion, are often followed in entering the National Corn Yield Contest, and that is just blindly shoot at the target of high yields and hope it works. And honestly, I think that's what a lot of the entries do in the National Corn Yield Contest. And if they get the super high yields, because they sort of blindly shot at it, they may not really know what of everything they did really contributed to high yields. Related to this, the second option is to simply throw the entire kitchen sink at the problem and hope it works. And again, this is a tactic that's often used, I think, for some of the winning entries. And this is not the way that you learn how to increase yields. It's a good way to maybe win corn yield contests. And if that's your only desire, your only goal in life is to win the corn yield contest, well, these first 2 options are probably acceptable because your only goal is to win the contest. You really don't care if you're making money, and so go ahead and use those 2 options. But if you want to increase yields smartly and economically, I think it's the third option you need to consider, and that's to approach the challenge of increasing corn yields from a thoughtful agronomic perspective. And that's what I want to spend the rest of this presentation on is, how can we think about this smartly, and how can we go about the process of increasing yields, maybe not going from 200 bushel immediately up to 616 bushel, but what can we do to increase 5 bushels here, 10 bushels here, and do it on a more wise kind of basis. So approaching it from a thoughtful perspective includes taking time to improve your own knowledge about the agronomics of growing corn, followed by taking the time to identify important yield limiting factors in your operation, and also locating them, and most importantly, diagnosing the causes of the yield limiting factors. And then from that, making sound agronomic decisions that are based on facts and data from your own investigations of your farming operation, and not decisions that are based simply on logic. And we got to be really careful with making decisions based on things that seem to make sense or things that are simply logical, because just because something appears to be logical does not make it true. And we live in such an age now of misinformation, almost everything we do in daily life, and it simply gets harder and harder to distinguish fact from crap. And when we're farming and trying to grow a profitable crop, it's really important to be able to do that. And again, just because it's logical doesn't make it true. Now, I love Mark Twain and the quotes that he has on a number of things. And there's one that I think is really appropriate to this sort of concept. And he's reputed to have said, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." Think about how often that, we're just convinced we know what's best for this field or that field. We're convinced we know how to grow the best corn. We don't necessarily know if it's true or not. And that's the point I'm trying to get at, is we got to be careful on making these decisions. Now, I can tell you that high-yielding corn requires a uniform, healthy crop canopy that's capable of intercepting and utilizing nearly all of the available sunlight that hits that acre of ground, and being able to do so at least by pollination time, and then continuing throughout the entire grain fill period. If you can achieve this one simple goal, you will get high-yielding corn. And knowing this fact gives you something to aim for, and really will form the premise for almost the rest of this presentation. So building that crop canopy begins with agronomic choices that we make prior to planting and continues throughout the entire growing season. And it's a lot of choices that we make that focus and build on just a range of different aspects of growing this crop. And just looking at these few that I've listed on this slide should give you the impression that this is not an easy task of building that canopy that's uniform and healthy and intercepting all that sunlight, and doing that every year on every field. It's not an easy task, and I think we all know that. And at the end of the day, your goal is to optimize the 4 components that multiply together to give us bushels per acre. And so we're looking at optimizing the number of plants per acre, and we're optimizing the number of ears per plant. Now, granted, most of our hybrids are pretty strong one-eared hybrids, so I guess the goal would be to make sure you get that one ear. If we had more variability in hybrids where we could go for 2 ears or even 3 ears, that'd be a different kind of thing. But for most of us, it's simply working towards ensuring there's one good ear per plant, and that good ear is sort of defined by these last 2 yield components. And so we need to optimize the number of kernels per ear and optimize the weight per kernel. If we can optimize these 4 yield components, then we're going to achieve maximum corn yield. Now, what you need to understand is that these individual yield components develop throughout the entire growing season. So that means achieving high yield requires minimizing stresses throughout the entire growing season. So the first yield component of population, we talk about final population or harvest population, but in fact, that final population is largely determined by the success of germination, emergence, and stand establishment. Now, stand establishment does not finish after the crop has emerged. Stand establishment finishes at about the V6 or 6 leaf collar stage, and it's a lengthy period. And so once you get to that V6 or roughly knee-high stage, what you have in terms of population is pretty much what's going to be there by the end of the season. And in addition to that, the health and uniformity of the plants in the field at V6, roughly knee-high, the health and uniformity of the plants at that point in time has a direct impact on the future potential growth rate of that field and its tolerance to stress. So in other words, if that field struggles getting to V6, and by the time it gets there, it's a uneven and ratty looking and yellow and green and every color under the sun and not very uniform and not very healthy, it's going to struggle throughout the rest of the season. There's just no 2 ways about it. And so again, the final population is determined by about V6 largely, and the health and uniformity of that crop is really important for how it's going to tolerate stress the rest of the year. So successful stand establishment relies on these factors that I've got listed on the slide. Now what I've done for you is to highlight the factors that you have some control over, or factors that you can manage. And so you've got control over the seed quality that you plant in the field. You've got control over the choices you make in hybrids as to whether it's got excellent genetic seedling vigor or not. You have control over the seed bed conditions and whether or not that seed bed is free of crust or free of surface compaction. Those seeds and seedlings need to be safe from insects and diseases during that stand establishment period. The young seedlings need adequate soil nutrients, adequate soil pH levels. The planting operation itself needs to be pretty much error-free. A part of that is achieving adequate and uniform seed-to-soil contact in that planter slot. And finally, the crop needs adequate and uniform soil temperature and soil moisture during that stand establishment period. And of course, we don't have control over that final bullet. But all of these other factors that impact on the success of stand establishment, you and I have control over, or at least we can manage it to a certain degree. And so as we're looking at yield limiting factors, these are some of the considerations in the early stages of factors that we need to be looking at and evaluating. Now, the potential ear size, that next yield component, or the beginning of the next yield component, is determined from about V6, roughly knee-high, to V14, or roughly shoulder-high. This time period is called the rapid growth period. So the plant is determining potential ear size, and by that we're talking about the number of ovules. And ovules are the potential kernels. Until they're fertilized by pollen, we don't call them kernels, and so we're creating ovules during this rapid growth period. And this rapid growth period is a very visual kind of period, and this field represents a little bit of what it looks like. And so you look at this field, you see nice dark green plants, you see a lot of shine to the leaves, and this is what is probably the first visual indication of a crop that's entering the rapid growth phase, is it takes on the dark green color and that shine to the leaves, and everything begins to develop exponentially. The above ground dry matter, above ground plants begin to develop exponentially. Below ground root tissue begins to develop like crazy. Everything takes off like a rocket. And it's that time period when the potential ear size is determined. Now, interestingly, the maximum number of kernel rows on those young ears is set as early as V8. Now, to put this in perspective, the ear itself is not initiated by the plant until about V5 or 6. And within a couple of leaf stages, the maximum number of rows is already set on those young ears. And then from that point forward up through about V14, the plants are determining what's the potential length of ears, or how many kernels per row. This yield potential is pretty much set in stone, meaning that after V8, there's no more opportunity to increase row number. And after V14, there's no more opportunity to increase the potential number of kernels per row. And all of this is going on during this rapid growth period when the plant's just going through all sorts of rapid growth above and below ground. So consequently, severe stress that occurs during this rapid growth period can limit the potential row numbers or the potential kernel numbers per row. And understand that if potential row number and kernel numbers per row are limited, restricted during this rapid growth period, that lost yield potential can never be recovered. The goal is to maximize that potential ear size so that we have more to give up if stress occurs later. What we don't want to happen is to restrict the potential ear size from the get-go, and then the crop runs into further stress that limits the yield even more. And one more thing about this early severe stress and sort of the consequences of that. Early severe stress can often stunt the potential size of that crop, or in other words, stunt the potential size of that photosynthetic factory that's going to be fueling everything for the rest of the season. And that reduction of the size of the photosynthetic factory can cause problems down the road with perhaps poor pollination because there's not enough photosynthesis to support the activity. It can cause kernel abortion because of lack of enough photosynthesis, and it can influence kernel weight. So it certainly makes sense to minimize the risk of any severe stress during this rapid growth period that would significantly limit photosynthesis. So we're talking about competition from weeds during the rapid growth period. We're talking about soil compaction that can limit the size and the depth of the rooting of the plants. We're talking about severe nutrient deficiency or significant herbicide injury. And these first four bullets, again, are management issues or challenges or yield limiting factors that you have some control over in terms of your management. And then finally, excessively wet or excessively dry soils during the rapid growth period can also cause a reduction in the potential size of the ears. We don't have control over that, but by virtue of what we do on some of the other choices we might make the crop more tolerant to those excessively wet or excessively dry soils. Now, the rapid growth period determines the potential ear size, the potential number of kernels. The actual number of kernels are determined by the success of the pollination period and the initial survival of the kernels through about the milk stage of kernel development. And so we're talking about the importance of the nick or the synchrony between the silk emergence and the pollen availability during pollination. And we're talking about the stress that occurs in the first 2 to 3 weeks following pollination that, if it's severe enough, can cause kernel abortion. The symptoms of failed pollination are shown in this photo, and you've all seen it before. Your failed pollination basically results in cob tissue. There's no evidence of any kernels developing. You're looking at the glooms or what you're going to call chaff at harvest time. But this is what the symptoms of failed pollination look like. And failed pollination can occur from persistent clipping of the silks by certain insects like corn rootworm beetles or Japanese beetles. It can be caused by delayed emergence of the silks in response to severe drought stress. And when this happens, sometimes the silks come out so much later that the pollen is already gone, especially on the tip silks that tend to come out later than the rest of the silks on the ear. If conditions are both hot and low humidity during pollination, then sometimes those exposed silks will dry out very quickly. And you know, this past summer of 2020, I was a little concerned during pollination in some areas because we had some pretty dry humidity days with very intense sunlight. And some of the poor kernel set, the poor pollination we got this past year may have been caused by desiccation of exposed silks. Now, interestingly, I always worry when we get a consecutive number of really cloudy days during pollination, and I worry because of the effect that has on reducing photosynthesis. And so it's true that if you get some excessively cloudy weather during pollination, that can also cause failure of the fertilization of those kernels. Some of the late applied post-herbicides that we use can cause direct injury to the developing ovules or the tassels, and that's why most of our herbicide labels have some caution on how late we can apply them. And then finally, if plants are unhealthy in general, for any number of reasons or any number of stresses, if the plants are unhealthy during pollination and photosynthesis is greatly restricted, that can cause or lead to pollination failure in the field. Now, the symptoms of kernel abortion are different from those of failed pollination. In most cases, we can see the aborted kernels. They're still visible. They're usually somewhat shrunken, usually have a bit of a white color to them. And sometimes if they developed far enough before they aborted, you'll see evidence of the yellow embryo inside the white or translucent kernel. So again, the symptoms are far different than what we see on failed pollination, where we only see the cob tissue on a failed pollination. And just a simple difference in the symptoms can sometimes help you determine the time frame of poor kernel set when you're trying to do some diagnosis in the field later on during grain fill. And of course, kernel abortion occurs primarily in response to severe limitation of photosynthesis from late silking through the early milk stages of development. And it sort of makes sense. If the plant's not photosynthesizing as much as it should, there's not enough photosynthate or carbohydrate available to these young developing kernels, that can easily trigger abortion. So some of the causes of limited photosynthesis include severe nutrient deficiency. This is a drone image of one of our trials showing very severe nitrogen deficiency that has already fired the lower leaves. The upper canopy is light yellow. And if this severity of nutrient deficiency is present at pollination or early stages of grain fill, that can easily cause abortion of kernels, and particularly kernels towards the tip of the cob. Severe leaf disease, it destroys leaf tissue, and therefore it reduces photosynthesis and can cause kernel abortion because of limited photosynthetic output. Excessively high plant populations are stress in and of themselves. And that's one of the reasons why you shouldn't get too crazy on how aggressive you are with plant populations if the field does not need it, because the high populations can represent a severe stress on the crop and lead to pollination problems and kernel abortion problems. Severe heat or drought can certainly reduce photosynthesis and cause abortion. Leaf loss due to hail. Excessively warm nights. You've heard us talk about this concern before, that these excessively warm nights during or shortly after pollination can lead to kernel abortion. And what happens is that these excessively warm nights tend to fuel or speed up this respiration process that goes on in the nighttime hours. It's a sort of a maintenance physiological mechanism that's necessary for the plant. But in excessively warm temperatures, the rate of respiration, frankly, becomes excessive, and the plant consumes more carbohydrate than it should, leaving less carbohydrate available to fill the kernels. And so when we get these excessively warm nights during or shortly after pollination, that's always a red flag to me in terms of looking at kernel set later on. And then, much similar to what I said during pollination, if the field experiences consecutive cloudy days in those early weeks following pollination, that can limit photosynthesis enough to cause kernel abortion. So as we look at this long list of factors that can limit photosynthesis and cause abortion, several of them you've got some control over in terms of nutrient deficiency and leaf disease and populations. And so again, some factors for you to consider as you're looking for ways to minimize that stress on the photosynthetic process. Now, the rest of the grain fill period is all about determining kernel weight, right? Plant populations have already by and large been decided. Kernel numbers have already been decided up to about the milk stage. The rest of that grain fill period is about determining kernel weight. And interestingly, once the crop reaches the early dent stage of development, think about this. Sometimes we sort of breathe a sigh of relief that we've gotten that far and boy, things are almost made. Understand that from that early dent stage on, the plant deposits or produces half of the kernel dry weight during those last 30 days. So when we get to full dent, we're not through, we're not done, we're not over the hump. There's still half of that yield left to be deposited in that grain to achieve maximum kernel weight. And so I want to show you a graph on that sort of reinforces the impact of kernel weight on yield. All right, now understand, kernel weight is simply one of the four components that determine yield. You can maximize or optimize your final population. You can optimize your number of ears per plant. You can optimize the number of kernels per ear. But if stress has an effect on kernel weight, it can cause unbelievable impact on yield. So this is an example using the corn yield estimation formula that a lot of us use in the field, where we go out and mark off 1,000th acre, we count the number of ears, we determine the average number of rows around the ear, the average number of kernels per row, and we multiply that ear number times kernel row number times kernels per row, and we take that result and we divide it by a fudge factor. And that fudge factor represents kernel weight. For a long, long time, we've used a fudge factor of 90. And what that represents is 90,000 kernels per 56-pound bushel. Today's hybrids, and this number goes all the way back, probably to the 60s, when this formula was first put forth out of the University of Illinois. But today's hybrids generally have heavier kernels than they did 30, 40, 50 years ago. And it's more common today that today's hybrids probably vary from 75,000 to 85,000 per bushel, all right? Heavier kernels, it takes fewer of them to give us a 56-pound bushel, all right? So I want to show you this example of grain yield versus kernel weight for a situation that has the same number of ears per acre, 32,000 ears per acre, for the same number of kernel rows per ear of 16, the same number of kernels per row, or 35, and the only thing I'm going to change in this estimation formula is kernel weight, all right? So, and let me just make sure you understand that low numbers on this axis, represent heavy kernels, and high numbers on the axis represent light kernels, all right? You with me on that? So, 32,000 ears per acre, 16 kernel rows per ear, 35 kernels per row, with 65,000 kernels per 56-pound bushel. The calculated estimate of yield would be 276 bushels per acre. All right? Now, that may be surprising with a modest 32,000 population and, frankly, an average ear, a modest ear of 16 rows around by 35 kernels long with a 65,000 kernel per bushel kernel weight. That's 276 bushels per acre. Now, if you went from 65,000 kernels per bushel to 70, a 5,000 difference in kernel weight, not very much kernel weight. The yield goes from 276 to 256. Changing kernel weight by that small amount loses 20 bushels per acre. And I'll just go through the rest of these calculations. At 75,000 kernels per acre, it drops to 239. At 80,000 per acre, at 80,000 kernels per bushel, it drops to 224. And frankly, a lot of us grow corn that averages around 80,000 kernels per bushel. And look what we could get if we could get that kernel weight up to 65. If it's 85,000, it drops to 211. If it's 90,000, 199. 95,000, 189. If you're at 100,000 kernel bushel weight, it drops to 179. 100 bushel swing in yield simply due to kernel weight. So I ask you, do you think that assuring crop health during the last 30 days in the field is important? I say yes, it is. And this needs to be a focus on the decisions we make agronomically that lead towards keeping a crop canopy healthy throughout the entire grain field period. It's very dramatic. So we know that inadequate photosynthesis is the primary stress during grain fill that causes lighter weight kernels. If that crop canopy is not photosynthesizing at its maximum, kernel weight will also not end up at its maximum. We know that severe nutrient deficiency reduces the photosynthetic leaf area and therefore reduces photosynthesis. The same with severe leaf diseases, the same with insect damage, the same with excessive drought and heat, defoliation by hail, excessively cloudy, hazy days, especially if they're strung together consecutively during the grain fill process. Early onset of stalk rots that just kill the plant. Well, clearly it's not going to photosynthesize much when it's dead, and that leads to premature maturation of the kernels and lightweight kernels. And finally, in a late planted year, we always worry about getting a killing frost before the crop is mature, and when we do, what it affects first and foremost is kernel weight, because it destroys photosynthetic leaf area. So again, I've highlighted those things on this list that you have some control over. And unfortunately, quite a few things on this list are things we don't have control over. And so it's always a bit of a roll of the dice every year as to whether we get through grain fill successfully and maximize kernel weight. But again, you saw the impact of kernel weight and what it can have on yield at the end of the day. And so again, this late season plant health is just critical for going from average crops to way above average crops simply based on kernel weight. So this sort of brings me to this slide and this question of what's the secret of achieving higher yields in the future, because that's what we're all about, right? We're trying to figure out how can we increase yields next year and the year after that. And some of us would like to increase yields 100 bushel, but even if you're only trying to increase yields 5 or 10 bushel at a crack, what is the secret to achieving higher yields? Now, I've thought about this for a long time. I've been here since 1982. I've had a lot of time to think. And it has dawned on me that the answer to this question is actually pretty simple. The secret to achieving higher yields is to figure out why you're not achieving high yields today. All right? And what this is really about is identifying and mitigating the yield limiting factors that are specific to your fields. All right? And I don't mean to be facetious about this, but this is what it comes down to. If you want to increase yields in the future and do it consistently, you need to figure out what's holding the field back today. And it does come down to these yield limiting factors. And if you fail to identify and diagnose those yield limiting factors, then some of the agronomic decisions you will make are going to totally miss the mark. And you're either going to waste dollars on inputs that you don't need, or you're going to leave yield on the table because you failed to identify inputs that you need, or you're going to lose out on both. Okay? This is critical in terms of increasing yields on your farm operation, because I can't tell you how to do it until I become familiar with your farm, and even then, you're always going to know your farm better than me. You can't read something in a farm magazine and say, oh, that's for sure going to work for me on my farm, unless you know that you have the same problem that this farm magazine talked about that was increasing yields, all right? So identifying yield limiting factors is crucial. And understand this: there are no silver bullets. There are no decisions, there are no inputs that work for everybody. The search for yield limiting factors is a season-long mission that requires a lot of time and a lot of effort. And remember, these yield components that we've talked about, plant population, potential ear size, number of kernels per ear, dry weight per kernel, these components are developing throughout the entire season. And so that's why the search for those factors that are holding back yield for you, the search is a season-long effort. Now, we've got some tools or sources of data that can be really useful on this mission to identify yield limiting factors. I sometimes think we forget that yield maps can be really useful if we use them as roadmaps to simply identify where are the problem areas in a field, especially where are the problem areas that seem to occur year in and year out in a field. And when we use yield maps as roadmaps, they allow us to focus on specific problem areas of the field and focus our mission, our efforts on diagnosing why those are yield limiting areas of the field. Now, as we go about that process, we've got a number of tools in the toolbox, and when you're using yield maps, say, to focus on problem areas of the field, I think it almost always has to begin with soil sample analyses or plant tissue analyses to determine whether or not these low-yielding areas are based on nutrient deficiencies or soil pH issues. And so keep in mind that this can be an extremely valuable tool in that toolbox. I've got a picture of our 2021 corn and soybean field guide. If you're not familiar with that resource, it's a great pocket guide to use in the field as you're going about the business of trying to figure out the causes of yield limiting factors. And included in that pocket guide are tables that help you interpret the results from things like soil test analyses, soil test results, or plant tissue analysis results. So be sure you get your hands on one of these field guides once they get published here after the first of the year. So yield maps can be useful road maps, but so can aerial images. And we now have access, especially to drone imagery and increasingly to aircraft and satellite imagery, and understand that these kinds of aerial images can also be used as road maps to simply identify where are the problem areas in the fields. And often these aerial images taken earlier in the summer mirror what we see at the end of the year on the yield maps. And this is an example here of one of our fields in eastern Indiana with a aerial image that we've converted to, it's a plant health image. Technically it's a red NDVI image taken in middle of July. And if you compare that to the yield map from October, many of those low yielding areas were showing red in the aerial image in July. And if you're familiar with these plant health images, often we color the poor looking areas red and the better looking areas green. So these areas often match up and both, whether you're looking at aerial imagery or yield maps, again, the key thing is they help us focus on specific problem areas in the field. And aerial imagery often has advantages over just using the yield maps to identify problem areas. If we fly, especially if you've got drones available, where you can fly the fields throughout the entire season, this aerial imagery allows us to spot problems as they're developing. They allow us to spot the problems earlier in the season. And any time that we can identify that a problem is developing early, we can usually go in and diagnose it a little more easily because the symptomology is still there. Some of the evidence, it may still be there. Everything is simply more fresh and more easy to diagnose. In this particular case, this is actually an aerial image taken in August of one of our on-farm trials, and you see the large areas that are dead or dying, and I'm circling one of them for you here. But these areas that were dying from drought stress in August were identified earlier by drone imagery as being odd, and it turned out that those areas, when we walked the field earlier in the season when it was still wet, those areas were wet areas. I call them wet feed areas. Root development was hindered, and that restricted root development then came back to be a serious limitation once the dry weather began to set in later in the summer. So again, aerial imagery can help you spot problems earlier and give you a better tool or better opportunity to diagnose the cause of yield limiting factors later. So this is the same field in August, only what it looks like on the ground. And in those healthier areas, the plants were still green, the ears were early dent stage, the ears were still upright, the husk leaves were green, everything was looking pretty nice. And then as you go from the areas of healthy corn to the areas that were drought stressed, it was extremely vivid as you walk. And the change occurred within feet of healthy moving into drought stressed areas. And in those areas, the plants were already dying prematurely. The ears, instead of being upright, were droopy or declining. They were already full dent, and the milk line had already disappeared into the cob, meaning that black layer was soon to be occurring. And so again, boots on the ground kind of walking is important and really needs to supplement some of this aerial imagery. Now, the other thing I want to say about drone imagery is that typically that imagery has a much higher resolution than what we typically get from satellite imagery. And by higher resolution, I mean you can see the details better. So this is an example of an irrigated cornfield Um, and it's showing differences in color. And I'm highlighting these areas at the beginning of the anhydrous passes, which show the typical delays in the full flow of that fertilizer as you begin an applicator pass. Now, those are big enough that the consequence on yield might be detected by the yield monitor at harvest time. But there are other details in here I want to point out. If you look closely, you'll see that there's a single outside row of that applicator that simply was not putting on as much nitrogen as the rest of the applicator bar. It's a little hard to tell from the image, but on the ground, that's pretty serious nitrogen deficiency on those rows. And on that row basis, the yield loss is probably 25% or higher on a row basis. But because the effect is on single rows, the yield monitor will probably never show any difference going across the field because that row gets blended in with all the others coming into the combine header. And so the point, again, I want to make is with high-resolution drone imagery, you can spot problems in the field that will likely never be detected in the yield map at the end of the day. So drone imagery gives you this opportunity to spot potential yield-limiting factors that you otherwise would never see. So I think I told you earlier, I really have no idea what your serious yield-limiting factors are in your farm because I don't know your farm. I don't know what kind of situations you're dealing with. So let me just share with you a few of the common yield-limiting factors to consider. You might consider this a top 5 or top 6 list if you want, but understand these are common yield-limiting factors. Your fields may not suffer from one or more of these, all right? But these are some things to consider. I think it's true throughout much of the Eastern Corn Belt that inadequate soil drainage is a serious yield-limiting factor, coupled with the usual ample rainfall that we get during the summer. And so certainly improving soil drainage, either by improving tile drainage or by improving surface drainage, is crucial for reducing that yield limiting effect. Hybrid performance is another common yield limiting factor, and maybe it's one that you don't often think about, but there are, even with today's modern hybrids that are way better than hybrids of 30 years ago, there's still dramatic differences between hybrids in two ways. One is their genetic yield potential, and so it's as crucial today as it was years ago to look for as much variety trial information as you can, either from public universities or from the companies, to look at differences in genetic yield potential among hybrids and make sure that you're identifying hybrids that do truly have superior yield performance. And I dare say that even among so-called good hybrids, there can easily be a 20 to 30 bushel difference on yield potential. And if you're not using trial data to choose hybrids, you're really missing out on something that'll help you out. But along with simply genetic yield performance is the characteristics or the traits of hybrids that allow them to tolerate stress. And this aerial image is of a field, one of our on-farm trials several years ago. And it's showing the consequences of cold, wet, crusty conditions followed by seedling blight that spring. And it shows the dramatic difference in two hybrids and how those hybrids tolerated those combined stresses. Needless to say, if the farmer had known that hybrid A would tolerate stress that much better than hybrid B, he probably would have used more of hybrid A. How do you find this out? Again, I'd say it comes back to looking at the results of variety trials that are conducted over a wide range of locations, because that wide range of locations will probably give you a wide range of growing conditions. And that's the best way to look for hybrids that are consistent performers over a broad range of growing conditions. Another common yield limiting factor to consider is soil compaction. And of course, the risk of soil compaction goes hand in hand with the drainage quality of a field. The more poorly drained fields are simply at a high risk of soil compaction because they tend to be wetter more often and during times of tillage and harvest and planting and you name it. But soil compaction is one of these gifts that keeps on giving. And it restricts rooting depth. That's a key thing that it does. It also exacerbates soil drainage. If you've got a poorly drained field and you create soil compaction by working it wet or just being on it wet, that compaction is going to make a poorly drained field even more poorly drained. It's going to allow it to stay saturated even longer, and thus its effects on rooting will be even longer. But again, a lot of us, I think, could take steps with the tillage operations we use, the tillage equipment we use, the tire traffic that goes over the field. There's a lot of opportunities to reduce soil compaction and simply enable better rooting of the crop that, among other things, will allow that crop to tolerate a later occurring drought stress better. We all know the problems that continue to occur because of weeds developing resistance to herbicides. And I'm not a weed scientist. I don't pretend to be knowledgeable in this area. I'm just here to say, make sure that you know whether you've got resistant weeds in your fields. Take the appropriate steps to manage them. Listen to the likes of Bill Johnson here at Purdue and other weed scientists on how to manage these weeds. But certainly it's a problem today and it's likely to get worse in the future. In the Eastern Corn Belt, because of our high humidity conditions, we simply have a high risk of foliar leaf diseases in corn. And these include gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight, and increasingly, especially in the northern parts of the state, increasingly this new disease called tar spot. So make sure as you're walking fields, crop scouting, seeing foliar diseases, make sure you make the effort to diagnose them accurately. And then, among other things, as you choose hybrids for the following year, make sure you're looking for hybrids that have good genetic resistance to these foliar diseases. That one single step of hybrid decision making will help reduce the possibility that you're going to need foliar fungicide later on. Of course, nutrient deficiencies or soil pH problems are common limiting factors throughout much of the state. I already mentioned that if you're using yield maps or aerial images to identify problem areas of the field, use those as road maps to tell you where to pull maybe some additional soil samples or plant tissue samples in order to determine whether or not nutrient deficiencies are causing the problem or whether a low soil pH is, or maybe the two together. And to sum up, I just simply leave you with this reminder, this encouragement that, we need to focus on the fundamentals of growing corn, the fundamentals of how we go about increasing corn yields. And you do this in a thoughtful agronomic way by improving your agronomic knowledge, by identifying, locating, and diagnosing the important yield limiting factors for your specific fields, and finally, by making sound agronomic decisions based on all of that information that you've generated from your efforts in the field and on other data and other resources that you come across, but to make these sound agronomic decisions that are going to minimize the risk of these yield limiting factors from occurring and also make the crop a little more resilient to stress that occurs later in the season. Well, that's about all I had to share with you today. I hope there were some useful nuggets of information that will be of use to you. If you have any questions about what I've said or what I've shown you, you've got my email address down on the lower part of the screen. Don't hesitate to send me an email. I'd be glad to visit with you. This has been Bob Nielsen. Thanks for watching.